Oh, there's plenty of people. Aloha nui kako o wau o kumulalemia. Welcome to Honua Scholars Dialogue session. We are pleased to have Dr. Kyle Yoshida. Welcome to our Zoom session. This is going to be recorded, and we're just going to get started. I'm going to read Dr. Yoshida's bio. Let me find it. Okay. Dr. Kyle Yoshida is a postdoctoral researcher in the Mechanically Intelligent Autonomous Robotics Lab at Washington State University. He received his MS and PhD in mechanical engineering at Stanford University and his SB in bioengineering with an African Studies minor, BS, sorry, Bachelor's of Science in Bioengineering with an African Studies minor at Harvard University. He also is a graduate of Kamehameha School's Kapaa Lama campus. He received the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship, Stanford Graduate Fellowship, Stanford Enhancing Diversity in Graduate Education Fellowship, and the Washington Research Foundation Postdoctoral Research Fellowship. His work, spanning robotics, haptic perception, and human-robot interfaces, has been recognized through awards at the IEEE International Conference on Soft Robotics, the IEEE International Conference on Robotics and Automation, and the IEEE/RSJ International Conference on Intelligent Robots and Systems, as well as the Society for Integrative and Comparative Biology National Conference. He's also a Light the Pathway Scholar and Fellow with the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. In his free time, he manages Honua Scholars, a STEM mentorship program recognized as one of the top 10 native STEM enterprises to watch by the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. We're delighted to have you, and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you for the intro and thank you everyone for coming. So today I'm just gonna give a short talk, like the Costco sample of some of the work that I've been doing and will be doing. Um, so we'll kick it off. So about me, as a recap, graduated from Kamehameha. Some things I like to do are scuba diving, and I really like forest hikes. I'm quite scared of heights, so some of the ridge trails are like no for me. Um, Went over to Harvard, did bioengineering and a minor in African studies. Um, I was told that I might have been the first student to do that combo in the history of the school. Um, Stanford for my master's and PhD in mechanical engineering, and then I'm a postdoc at Washington. Oh, and I guess I should have put another arrow. I'm starting in July as a assistant professor at UCLA in mechanical and aerospace engineering. So kind of the center of my work is combining haptics and robotic systems and looking at how we can incorporate that into different applications in daily life. So in haptics, I work on basic design and perception. I'll go over what haptics is on the next slide, but um, they're kind of these different devices that we wear and interact with technology. Some work with outreach and education, community-driven kind of projects. Soft robotics, I work on actuator design, different crowdsourced and clinical perception tests using smartphones. Agriculture robots, so these are to help with fruit picking. Different human-robot interfaces, so understanding how this combination of using soft robots and haptics can be used to interact with robots. And then kind of combination of all of the different areas are things like social robot interfaces, where I'm trying to design new robot interfaces that allow us to use the sense of touch, but integrate new soft robotic systems, but they have kind of a more social HRI, human robot interaction component, where we're able to use these things to interact and engage with others. So today I'm just going to quickly go over each one of these boxes. Um, but before I do that, I'll start off with like what is haptics. So haptics is kind of like my the main center of a lot of my work, and haptics is something relating to the sense of touch. So um, there's two kind of pathways that we receive haptic information. The first is through kinesthetic. So this deals with location and configuration of your joints in space, your overall large body motions, the different forces that we feel between our joints and muscles. The other kind of path or mode is cutaneous or tactile. And this consists of things that are more on the skin level. So things like temperature, texture, skin's kind of the slip of our skin, vibrations, and small forces that just result in indentation of the skin. So there's a picture of someone pouring a glass of water, and some of the kinesthetic feedback that they feel is like the orientation of their wrist, kind of the weight of the glass and the container, while some of the cutaneous or tactile feedback would be things like the temperature of the glass, kind of the texture of the glass, and if the glass is slipping. So the first area in haptic devices, I've worked on designing custom devices that can give different types of skin shear and normal indentation at the wrist. So you can imagine a device where like you touch something in virtual reality and you want to feel how stiff or how hard something is. And what we can do is we can actually like portray those forces on the wrist. So we use kind of these pneumatic systems, and I use these soft robotic systems to um, use pneumatics to impart those forces. So this is a device that just delivers, it does a few things, but I did one experiment just testing how well it delivers four directions of feedback. So if this device were to just go on the skin and stroke the skin up, down, left, right, how well can users perceive that? So to the right is one of the analyses that we use. It's called a confusion matrix. And in an ideal case, you want solid dark blue 100s across that diagonal line. And what this is it matches the delivered stimulus with the stimulus perceived by the user. So if we use the device and told the user up, how often does the user perceive up? So in this case, they perceive up 81% of the time. And overall, the accuracy on this device, I think, is like 85-ish percent, which is like relatively good because chance is at 25%. Um, in the realm of soft robotics, I work on designing kind of fundamental actuators in soft robotics. So one of the main contributions that I made is using these active fiber constraints to increase the kinematic output of soft actuators. So it's all the same actuator, and an actuator is just something that kind of moves when it's powered. And in this case, we use pneumatics to kind of power it. So in each of these cases, we can move the fibers around and then you get different outputs. And we don't have to go over this, but this is just a heat map. And just know that on the X and Y axes are different angles of the fibers. And it's a colorful plot that has a lot of different ranges of twist and displacement. And that's kind of how we experimentally show that the actuator can reach a large workspace. Um, so the next thing I'll talk about is kind of that third bubble. And this is about community, some of the more community-driven work. So I do some work with Honua scholars, which is focused on bringing people into research, publishing papers while impacting the community. And in this kind of realm, there's a few other papers that I've worked on. So one of them, all the way to the left, I was working with a group, and they're just trying to find out how team dynamics play a role in how well your design group performs. So you can imagine, like, what are different ways that we interact with people, and how can we change those interactions to have better performance? And one of those kind of metrics is actually through nonverbal communication. So I created kind of a neural network that is used to identify gestures that people make. So we can kind of film a design group and kind of evaluate how well they might perform on a certain task. Um, some other work during COVID was using things like Google search indexes and understanding how COVID affected kind of the interest in different surgeries. So that's the plot to the right. Um, Essentially, we found things like, oh, when coronavirus happened, people began to like not search up terms related to surgery. But this also created a backlog in the number of surgeries that people needed. So it's kind of understanding like different issues in the community and new approaches to understand or tackle those issues. And so one of those things and working that in that area is I started working during COVID, like how can I connect it back to kind of my main line of work in haptics? And I realized that we can use crowdsourcing to kind of develop new haptic perception studies. And how this works is we created a smartphone app that gives research study for haptics, so smartphones can vibrate. And I created an experiment where we had participants um, use smartphones, come into lab, walk on treadmills, and we were able to measure different things. So this is a graph from one of the papers where we found that we could measure response time to just different types of stimuli. So we found things like, oh, people react fastest to like beeps that are annoying, like loud, annoying beeps, and they react slower to maybe like a small, gentle vibration. In addition to that, I also found that we could use these smartphones for different clinical studies. So currently, I'm working with a PhD student at Stanford and a few doctors there, and we just finished up a study with diabetic patients, and we found that we could actually use smartphones to detect peripheral neuropathy. So, what peripheral neuropathy is when kind of the peripheral nerves start to degrade. So people have a hard time kind of feeling things on their feet. And what doctors usually do is they get a monofilament shown in the picture all the way on the left, and they kind of just poke the toe and see if they feel it. But you need a clinician for this. Like you usually go in to see a physician, and we realized that we could actually implement this on a smartphone so that people who are not diagnosed with diabetes can then download the phone app, just test how well they can sense vibrations, and we can actually use that as a proxy to identify if they are at risk for diabetes or nearing kind of starting to get diabetes because of that peripheral neuropathy measure. Also, some work with masks during COVID and how to create new masks with new kind of oxygen generators for healthcare workers. And finally, in the middle, some work on human and social robot interfaces. So this is just a video. We made kind of a sensor, and we can use this soft sensor to detect different interactions that a human imparts. So you can see like tickling, shaking. And what we're doing is we're creating kind of a database of all of these forces so that we can then design haptic devices that can deliver these that can be worn. So imagine giving your auntie or uncle a remote long distance hug or giving them a tickle. By measuring them through sensors and then building actuators, we can give that long distance communication. We also have some work uh, with interacting with robots, moving blocks around on new robot interfaces. So oftentimes you use like Xbox controllers in daily life, but what if we could use the movement of our body? And I think that might be, oh, okay. And I think this is the last slide. So agriculture robots, building new types of soft robots that can be used for apple picking, other fruit harvesting, pruning trees. And we found is that using these soft robots, they can work well alongside humans. So we're also looking at different types of scenarios in kind of healthcare, in-home care, in-home assistance, in addition to agriculture, working alongside workers, kind of picking the apples that are at the tops of the trees that workers, it's not as efficient for workers to pick or not as easy. Yeah. So yeah, that's just an overview of my work. And kind of one of the takeaways is that one of the things I always focused on is like I started off in lab working on these haptic devices and soft actuators, but kind of um understanding and being inspired by my surroundings, like I try to move those into new areas and new regions. So like working on like this new mobile phone platform, clinical tests, where you can apply concepts like within your main field into new applications. And what I found is that those new applications and experiments were actually like some of the most successful work. So here's some acknowledgements with funders, and all of kind of the students, co-authors, advisors, and collaborators. And yeah, that'll be it. And I'll stop sharing this. But yeah, if anyone has questions, now is the time. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Kyle. This is Rika Suzuki, and I think it's really interesting when you apply these to healthcare because I don't know if you looked at all about the way you might apply repetitive movements like if I'm very concrete, like diaper changes for caregivers, and like these kind of very rote similar things, and then on the other side of the spectrum might be things like how you console a person by maybe stroking their shoulder or whatever that might be more individualized, but there are certainly some things in healthcare that are very and blood pressure and things like that. But yeah, it's really fascinating what you're doing.
Cool, thank you. I did get a question in the chat, like directed to me, but the question was like, um, how does one sign up to take kind of our smartphone tests and experiments, and when will it go to market? That is the golden question. So right now we're still doing in-lab trials for validation of the kind of platform and tests. We're actually hoping to publish that in the next few months. And we want to do like a more longitudinal study across different research sites and hospitals. And we're currently working on we're not doing, it's hard to kind of patent medical, I guess, diagnostic medical devices. Like, there's kind of like guidelines for patents where that doesn't really get patented. But there are kind of copyrights around kind of the algorithm we use and kind of like the database that we're using to match patients against. So that's something we're working on, and it would be really cool if a company picks it up and uses that as kind of their platform for implementing it. Um, and yeah, in the coming years, where I'm hoping to get it on a platform and get it ready where anyone around the world can just download it and participate. But that's probably 1 or 2 years out to make sure everything works. another challenge that's interesting with that is going across different smartphones. So all of my work was with one smartphone. And as you change different phones, they have different actuators. So it's hard to benchmark experiments between those platforms. So it's another variable, which is why it's not as easy to just have it all dispersed at once. So that's interesting. Cool. I see another thing in the chat, but what got me interested in haptics? And how do I decide which projects to initiate, join, or support? So that's a good question. During my undergrad, I did things in the realm of bioengineering and I grew up doing kind of like the cell culture molecular work from KS and also some summer internships. But I wasn't a fan of my life revolving around cells growing in a petri dish. So I thought it would be cool to go into engineering because kind of the limit in when and how much you want to work is like I guess the only thing you ever have to wait for is an order to come in. But I really like where if I want to work, I can, and if I don't feel like working, I don't have to worry about going in to feed cells. But a lot of that experience with the biology and setting up the experiments, it made me still want to work with things that deal with kind of human patients, potentially on a more applied scenario. And haptics was kind of that bridge between you're building these mechanical systems, but you can also apply them and you do user studies where you interact with patients and you still kind of get that experimental scientific side. Um, One of the things I noticed is that with some of the more fundamental robots, you don't get as much of that experimenty kind of user study space where it's just like, oh, you're just characterizing a robot. So I think it's fun to kind of create experiments, see how humans will interact with the device. There's a few studies in the future where it's like a lot of researchers also look at things like deception. So it's like, is a robot shaking your hand or is a human shaking your hand? Like there's kind of like these Turing tests of haptics that are also really interesting that it's like kind of like the psychology gaming aspect is also interesting. So that's why I was interested in haptics. And I feel like a lot of the projects that branch out from my primary areas are like things where you kind of just find a connection and it's like, oh wow, like, like a family member has diabetes, like, whoa, I found out they can't feel things. Wait, I do haptics. We research how people feel different things. Like maybe there's something there. And sometimes uh it just works and you can go forward and there's research paths and sometimes like it doesn't pan out and there's like a loss. But what's interesting about haptics is it's a relatively new field. So like things like the metaverse and stuff, they're just beginning to start. And so I see the field having a lot of growth in a lot of areas, and especially with ChatGPT on kind of this AI side, there's going to be a lot more work in terms of how do we get this text chatbot to actually interact and interface with the world. And I think that a lot of that area is in haptics and robotics. So like understanding how we can use language models to control robots. So we can just go straight from, hey, robot, wash my dishes, to the actual robot doing the task. So that's why I think this field is like also very exciting. Um, yeah, I see another comment to me about like, oh yeah, there's a lot of potential applications with telehealth. So yeah, I kind of like the whole phone haptics kind of line of work was inspired by my time in Hawaii and like learning about how there's some times where patients fly between islands or like might even have to drive for a long distance from like North Shore or something. So it's like if we could have your normal doctor interaction, but bring more devices out that are low cost and easy to use without much kind of error or noise, then that would be a really cool thing. And yeah.
Hey, Kyle, thank you for sharing. I know you're reading should I just enter my question in the chat? It's Kumute, Mr. Tate.
You can just say it. Yeah, I think that's all. So
So I was at Kaiser last year and actually at Wilcox as well, and they're installing these surgical robots, right? And the challenge, I think, obviously they've been existing for a few years now, and they're dial them in so a surgeon can operate the robot from a remote location, right? How do you see, and there's precision, and the robot isn't quote unquote alive, and I'm a biologist, not a mechanical engineer, so forgive me. But where would we see uses, like with haptics, you're talking about motion, picking up motion, understanding motion. You mentioned giving someone a hug or a tickle, right? What would the application be in medicine, for example, in surgery diagnostics, or um, uh, diagnosing a patient for treatment?
yeah, that's a good question. So there's kind of there's kind of two groups that I guess two areas that I often see with haptics interacting with medicine. So one is in like surgical robots. So kind of how you mentioned like physicians teleoperating a robot for using like the Da Vinci system. But kind of one of those things is there's like latency. When you're using a robot, you can't feel the tissue. So um like when you're entering the body, it's hard to tell like, oh, is this like hard tissue, soft tissue? So there's one of the people in my lab, he's actually now a faculty at a school that I forgot. But he's actually working on sensorizing kind of the tips of the Da Vinci robot so that you can understand and model force using tissue interactions. And then you can also build haptic devices so that the physician can expect what they will feel prior to potentially interacting with something in an adverse way. Another area is in the realm of kind of uh, affective haptics is its own field where people are building different devices for kids who might have depression or have learning difficulties or communication difficulties, and building different haptic devices that can help calm them or help them learn or interact with the world. So some people are working on robots that have haptic interfaces that help people who have a hard time kind of communicating in the developmental phase when they're children to be able to learn how to talk and interact with people. There's robots slash haptic devices that help you regain your or calm your heart rate. So there's experiments where like, oh, you can wear a haptic vest, and like if you have a lot of anxiety, like this vest will measure kind of how your breathing pattern is and what your heart rate is, and start to kind of change how you're breathing to decrease your anxiety and stress. So it helps you like rhythmically breathe.
Yeah,
So,
like a biofeedback thing.
yeah.
Yeah. So the other application that might be fascinating is like Parkinson's, which
Mhm.
is right an illness where the facial expression is becomes very blunted or masked, and they can't, communicate, and often it impairs, right, these interpersonal relationships.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, when I joined the lab, the project that kind of enticed me to join the lab was they're working with Facebook on a device for social touch.
Yeah.
And the idea was that Facebook wanted to build a device where we could relay these social touches um, to and across everyone. So like having a wearable device so that you can send haptic emojis or something so that um Facebook is trying to like metaverse things and really integrate with the physical world. And it's like interesting, you have this conversion to the digital virtual world, and then now it's like we're longing to build devices to make it more physical again. So alongside that, there's all kind of this more social sciences understanding where it's like, how does the population adapt to this? What are the effects in health and education and like society as a whole? Like, how does it affect human relationships? But I think that's also why I really enjoyed doing my minor in African studies, because it gave me kind of that lens on like whenever you're building a technology device, implementing it, it interacts with a larger ecological system. Yeah.
Kyle, I think to um, comment on what you just said, that was my biggest concern, years ago, is that we would disconnect from I don't know what the word is for it, humanness, right? And you mentioned the word emoji. Here are using these words, right? But that we would lose that as we moved into more, I don't know, it wasn't called AI back then, but automation and robotics, right? But I think what you're doing is at some level keeping us connected to our humanness using the device. The device is not us. I think it's really important that we understand, and correct me if I'm wrong. I had a meeting with Derek this morning, who's an engineer, right, and using some of these things. And I just, my fear was that we'd lose that human part of our interaction because of the robotic component of it, right? But I think that it sounds like what you're doing is maintaining that at some level. And you mentioned with surgery, understanding, being able to understand hard tissue from soft tissue could be a difference between, interfacing with a tumor versus whatever, a spleen or whatever. So that's really important. And looking forward to seeing how that progresses. But thank you for all you're doing.
Cool. Thank you. And cool. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. I think that we are at time. So I will stop the recording. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wait, what?